So, welcome to another show. Today we have Gary Simonds on the show, who is a retired neurosurgeon, amongst other things, such as being an author. So, welcome to today's show, Gary.
Thanks so very much for having me. What a pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely, pleasure's all mine, mate. Pleasure's all mine. So, neuroscience is I think quite a hot topic at the moment, especially with people like Andrew Huberman talking about it quite extensively, having such a big podcast. So, what's your experience? Because neuroscience is quite a broad area, isn't it? I suppose. What's specifically your experience? Obviously, you're retired now, but what was your main area of expertise?
Well, I'm retired from surgery now, but I still actually teach neuroscience to undergrads and med students. But the predominance obviously was in the surgical realm, including a lot of brain surgery and spinal surgery. And I was kind of a jack of all trades. I did pretty much the whole gamut of neurosurgery. And now I teach mostly general neuroscience and the neuroscience of basic neurological illnesses and diseases.
So, what does that look like? Is that things like ADHD, schizophrenia, etc., or are there more niche diseases that you are alluding to?
No, I mean those would certainly be come in the gamut of things. More commonly, probably brain tumors, trauma to the brain, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, all sorts of different diseases. There's unfortunately many.
So, have you noticed an uptick in Alzheimer's disease? And if so, have you got your own opinion as to why that's happened? Is it the metals, aluminium, etc., which is one of the things I've heard?
Well, excuse me for one second. Um, I think you know, there's a mixture of things that go on. We certainly know that we're just subject to a heck of a lot more toxins out there. We also live a lot longer than even just a few decades ago. And I think one of the highest risk factors for Alzheimer's is actually age. So as we live longer, certain things are potentially going to get us. But we believe it or not, we still don't really know what's going on in Alzheimer's. We really don't know the trigger. We know a lot about the pathology and the pathophysiology, but we're not actually overly confident that we know what causes it.
I'm glad that you said about the age thing, and I've got a theory, but it's obviously not proven or anything like that. But I was thinking one day, the brain is obviously a very complicated piece of equipment. It's very intelligent. You know, you can do complex sums and remember pretty much unlimited bits of information. But if we go back 30, 40, 50, 60 years, the amount of stimulus that the brain would consume on a day-to-day basis was a lot less. There'd be a lot more relaxation time. You know, you're not listening to podcasts 24/7, you're not writing books, you're not, driving a car, which again takes a lot of cognitive function. Adverts that are coming at us, we're working 9 to 5, all of these things, TV even, again, that's the cognitive use of time, cooking, etc. Could it be a case of actually using all of the brain's allocation of function essentially during that period of time, whether it's 60 years, 50 years, whatever, and then after that, it's the brain's kaput after that. Could that be an option?
Um, I am not aware of a lot of strong evidence behind that, but anything is possible when you start getting into these things. One of the things we actually do know about Alzheimer's is keeping an active brain uh, is actually somewhat protective. It's not 100%, it's not a 100% vaccination, but keeping an active brain, keeping learning things, learning new languages, getting into new hobbies, staying engaged is somewhat protective. So can we overdo it? I suppose I would argue maybe that another disorder that I'm very interested in may be more susceptible to what you're talking about, and that's burnout. I do think we live in this hyper complex society, as you're alluding to, and it's coming at us a mile a minute. And we're really not geared to be handling a million things at once. We're not truly multitaskers. Our systems will focus on one thing at a time and then switch back and forth. But it seems like we can certainly overload them. So I think there are certainly potential effects of this universe that we're in.
So with regards to burnout, would you use the word? Did you use the word disorder there for
Uh,
burnout?
it seems to be a decent
That's
word.
that's interesting that you've used the word disorder because I would never sort of allocate it to a disorder. I would see it as like an overwork. I don't even know what I would classify it as, but I'm actually interested the fact that you use the word disorder there because that seems to me like there's something that we can do to manage burnout. Are there certain things that we can do to stop burnout? And if we actually get burnout, is there things that we can do to manage it from there onwards?
Yeah, I would absolutely argue that there is. I think prophylactically, what we've worked on for a long time now is the idea of building resilience, being able to face stressors and not be damaged by them, not be brought down by them. And there's all sorts of strategies and methodologies that we can do to help build our resilience. I think once we're in a burnout state, it's not black and white. I think it's something that you can drift in and out of. I think it's very much on a spectrum, but doing things that help our brains kind of reorganize, restructure, uh, chill out, as you're alluding to, uh, can certainly go a long way. There's a metaphor that I think works well for me, at least for thinking about burnout, and that is we all have kind of a bank of energy within us, that energy that allows us to do the daily things we do in life, get up and get to work and do our things, face people, be civil, be kind. It takes a certain amount of energy, and we all have it in us. And I would say that everything we experience, everything we encounter, every person, every place, everything we see and hear, including our own mental meanderings and thoughts and feelings. They're either energy, they're either adding energy to that bank, making a deposit, or they're withdrawing it. And I think the easiest thing is to come up with all sorts of things that withdraw it. That's for sure. I mean, we can all think of the things that really, suck the life out of us. But to me, burnout would be a situation where you're just overdrawn. You're taking so much out of that energy bank that there's not much there to be used. And then even the simple things that normally restore it just aren't going to restore it quick enough. And so we are in this state of depletion.
Yeah, I mean, I think of burnout in a number of ways, really. There seems to be some sort of culture nowadays that, unless you're killing it, you're working 25 hours a day and doing that extra mile, that extra step, that extra email, unless you're like stressed out working so hard, you're never going to make it. That seems to be a sort of underlying concept that many people buy into, especially motivational speakers, etc., seem to say, "Oh, you're not working hard enough." But actually, that's not really the case. It's a case of working smarter, not harder. In fairness, and maybe that is something that leads to burnout. Maybe it's a case of not doing something that you enjoy, as you said about depleting your resources. If you're doing a job that you hate, it's probably more likely, or the likelihood of you experiencing burnout is a lot more than it would be otherwise. Now, there is obviously an argument as to whether correlation and causation are a thing, because with any argument, there are obviously fallacies involved. So, are there certain things that correlate with burnout or cause burnout, as I said, or is it just a case of it could be a whole host of things?
Yeah, I would argue that it's definitely come under the category of a whole host of things. And I think every individual is going to be different. And what potentially drags them down, and what potentially adds energy back to the bank, if you will, is going to differ from person to person. But we do know that, burnout is fairly common, particularly in people who are bright, energized, uh, you know, go-getters, if you will, who are in high demand and low control situations, which is basically, something that you're talking about. You're supposed to be going, 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 and yet you may feel like I'm doing all this and it's not getting us anywhere. I'm not moving the needle one bit. And so situations like that definitely can certainly precipitate uh, one degree or another of burnout. And I think basically any stressors, any unresolved stressors that continue to deplete us are going to add to this. So you can basically come up with lists and lists of things that stress us and potentially deplete us.
So is it a case of dealing with the stress as much as anything else? Because you can put 10 people into a room or into an experience, and some will get stressed, some will get scared, and some won't. Is that a real crucial part of it as well?
Yeah, again, I think all of us have different set points and different ways we respond to things. And we talk about kind of in the psychological aspect of this, that our responses to stressors can either be what we call adaptive or maladaptive. And when we say that, it's not a pejorative term. Maladaptive isn't pejorative. It doesn't mean we're doing the wrong thing. What it means is either our responses are either ultimately helping us, making us feel better, making us more right with the world, or they're not, which would be the maladaptive responses. And so one of the ways of dealing with burnout and trying to handle it potentially is to identify the stressors and figure, are our responses adaptive or are they maladaptive? And can we switch? Can we find a way that we meet our stressors and not get dragged down by them? So yeah, I think your point is very well taken.
Coming on to the word responses, because that opens up another can of worms. You obviously, as you sort of self-profess there, you're a generalist. You teach a wide range of neuroscience, and there are a lot of areas. So how things are affected by how we think. James Allen, as a man thinkers, things like that. Does optimism and pessimism affect the brain? So do we have responses mentally to how we think about things as well, or is there not enough in terms of evidence to sort of mix a science with what we feel on an intuition basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would argue that the science very much is beginning to align, with some of these more a priori conceptualizations that I think a lot of to us make a lot of sense, at least. So I think one of the best ways to look at this or to think about this, I'm going to step back one bit, but I think a lot of people see the brain as being very hardwired, as being just like our computers. It gets put together, it gets assembled in a factory, and the wiring diagrams, the way everything's put together, the way everything within the computer communicates with itself, all the wiring is pretty much set in the factory, and that's what you got from that point on. You can load it with a lot of software, which is what we do when we teach. I mean, we learn and read and all that sort of thing. We're loading our mainframe, if you will, with software. Um, but I think a lot of people see the brain that way, and it's far from it. The brain definitely, from person to person, has a certain amount of hardwiring, if you will. In other words, our major networks are set up fairly similarly, at least the major networks in the brain. But boy, when you get down to the individual neurons, when you get down to one neuron communicating with another, it is in constant flux. It is in constant change, and it is absolutely affected by our environments, by what we're processing, what we're thinking. And therefore, the argument can be made is it can be changed. It can be changed for the better or for the worse. A lot of the studies have gone into um, when it's made for the worse. So when we subject lab animals, for example, to constant stress. We can watch their wiring diagrams. We can watch their individual neuron communications and various networks actually changing, actually morphing. And there is evidence in humans when you start looking at functional MRIs and that sort of thing that very much are in sync with this. That certain areas of your brain, for example, when you are subjected to constant or high degrees of stress, certain areas of your brain shrink, and they're very much kind of the high processing areas of your brain, and other areas of your brain are magnified, and these tend to be your fight or flight areas of your brain, your stress response areas of your brain, for example, one area is called the amygdala, which very much is geared in with emotions, particularly fear and anxiety and um, anger reactions, and that will become magnified. Why? Because it's like the brain starts to adjust to being constantly under stress and in this fight or flight pattern. Whereas if you can shift it to a much more positive environment, then theoretically you begin to groove the networks that are more tied into higher processing and reward centers and that sort of thing of the brain. So long and short of it is the brain is in constant flux, constant change, and is absolutely responsive to both our inner and outer environments.
Is this sort of neuroplasticity then, in respect of it adapts and changes in line with how our behavior is essentially?
Yeah, you could definitely categorize it as a form of neuroplasticity. Sometimes in the neuroplasticity discussion, we tend to be thinking of major network rewiring or areas taking over for areas that are lost. So you think of maybe after a stroke, people often will talk about plasticity, but it very much goes all the way down, as I say, to these microscopic levels. And the way one neuron communicates with another is through what we call synapses, and those synapses are constantly changing, constantly upgrading or downgrading, and making new ones and taking away others. So it's really, to me, one of the more fascinating things about the nervous system, and I think actually ultimately one of the more optimistic things, because I do think we can change it for the better.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, and I can't do these experiments, but my sort of experience is that the brain is very malleable. If the weeds grow by default unless you plant, good plants, and if you do consciously practice the right things, you see this with sportsmen. They change their golf swing or they change how they punch into a punch bag, and after time, it goes from the subconscious to the conscious, and it then becomes an automated sort of function in regards of the subconscious mind. Is that something that we can do with how our actual brain operates in terms of thinking, or is it just how we feel, if that makes sense? Is there any hardwiring changes you think we can make by thought alone, or is it a case of, well, if you are born with certain hereditary conditions, there's nothing you can do about it? So, yeah, I mean, you'll know better than I will, the sort of examples there are there.
Yeah, I think if you have a a major disruption of major networks in your brain. Again, a stroke's a good example, or a severe head injury or something like that. It can be very hard to rewire enough to get everything up and running back to normal. But I think on a less drastic level, we absolutely can change things. And so, for example, I mean, a lot of the work we've done with burnout has been to groove people's thinking. And do I know, what exactly is changing within the brain? No, but you can kind of experiment with these things just on yourself. So for example, one strategy that we ask people to try is for a for 2 to 3 weeks to go into your world, into your life, and write down 5 things during the day that go that bring you pleasure, bring you joy, that make you feel happy. Just 5 good things a day, and write them down. And I guess you could do it on your phone, but I do it on a cue card or something. But write them down and do that. And when you get home at night, maybe just before going to bed, just take a look at those 5 things and remember them. But do that for about 2 to 3 weeks. And what people find is that they don't have to make themselves do it. They don't have to say, okay, now look for things, keep searching for things. What happens is the brain starts searching for them itself. It starts noticing these good things that are happening around you. And so you've already trained your brain in just a matter of a couple of weeks. And then when we look at people's mood elevation and that sort of thing in these circumstances, when they do that, their overall, mood is improved, their resilience is improved, and that sort of thing. So, simple exercises most of the time where we kind of, force ourselves into repetition, will often groove a different response.
I love that because it's something that I actually do every morning. Write down things I'm grateful for, write down my goals and things like that. Statements like self-talk and things like that. But the other thing that I also try and do, similar to what you've said there, in terms of a practical exercise that you can do, is anything that goes bad for me, and I use inverted commas there, quote unquote, bad, on the face of it, I try and think of positives that can happen. So an example I use, let's say your car breaks down on your drive. Obviously, it's not good because you're gonna have to spend money and you're gonna have to get a lift somewhere or get a taxi. But the positive or the less negative side is that you could have broken down. I mean, your car's gonna break down at some point. You could have broken down 1,000 miles from home on your own in the rain with no phone. So things could always be a lot worse. And I think that's a really good way to try and look at your life. Like you might have lost your job, but now you've got a chance to start a business. You didn't like your job anyway. You didn't like your boss. You can find a new job close to home with higher pay. So I think that's also a really good thing that people can do to try and, as you said, reprogram your mind to start thinking about these things without necessarily you needing to consciously do it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point, that just reframing things. And I would argue that that is an example of meeting stressors and trying to find a more adaptive way to respond to that stressor rather than giving in to anger or woe is me or whatever. Can I shift the way that I respond to that stressor and come out feeling better for it? Again, it's not necessarily the right way or the wrong way. It's just a more adaptive way to eventually bring you to where you want to be. I think a great example, and there used to be, I think it was Louis C.K. had a bit on this in comedy, but just talking about, traveling, and particularly when we travel by air, I think a lot of people get really wound up, and, it gets really easy to get angry about this and that and a 15-minute delay and stuff. On the other hand, you can kind of reframe it and think, my goodness, I am going from one point to another in the world in a matter of hours that not that long ago may have taken weeks, may have resulted in half the people dying, just trying to do it. And here I am able to do it in hours. I have a son who lives out in LA, and we get in the plane, and within 4 or 5, I guess it's 5 hours, we're there. We're in LA.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need to appreciate where we are. People always want to complain. We do have a negativity bias, don't we? Where we try and, we see the negative and everything. But actually, the stuff that you've got in your life now, you probably wished 4 or 5 years ago. You've got your own house. For
Yeah.
example, you might have a dog. You're having kids. You're getting married. You wanted that house and you wanted that mortgage, but you're complaining about the repayments. But everything that happens to you, the side effects come with that. If you've got kids, you're gonna have to probably wake up during the night sometimes. So you can't then complain about that when it's part and parcel of what you'd wished for, essentially. So moving on from the actual neuroscience part, because I know that as well as a lecturer and obviously a retired practitioner, you also write books. So you've got
Yes.
what, three non-fiction and one fiction? Is that right?
Yep, and a another novel on the way, and two more being sketched right now.
So let's talk about the non-fiction ones first. Are they to do with neuroscience, or is it something slightly different?
Yeah, they're actually all about burnout. So I got into the burnout business about 15 years ago, I guess, and that's what the books are about. I mean, I spent a career, writing about neurosurgery and all that sort of thing in various articles and pieces and stuff like that. But when it came to actually writing books, it came down to writing about burnout in healthcare workers because it's a big problem.
So is it specifically healthcare workers where you think, was that based on your personal experience, or do you think that's an area that is probably more prone than other areas because of the levels of stress, the long hours, etc., and maybe the more sensitive side of the job as well, as you said, people with diseases come in, etc. Is it maybe a bit of all of those why burnout is so prevalent?
Yeah, to be honest, I would argue that it's probably almost, if not more prevalent in various industries and various walks of life. It's just that I was so immersed in the healthcare world, I didn't feel qualified to start talking about the business world or anything else. But I do know the healthcare world very well, and so that's why we kind of stayed focused on that. For example, one thing about healthcare, one of the things we know is that if you can derive a sense of meaning out of your work, if you can feel like I'm doing something, it, it is somewhat protective. In fact, it can be very protective against burnout, and therefore we see people putting in, super long hours and super efforts in the healthcare sphere. So we do have a nice piece of healthcare is you always kind of have some meaning to it. Yeah, I'm helping other people. It's pretty obvious. It's in your face. If you're in the business world, it may not be as obvious to you. You may be doing great things for the country, for your community and stuff, but it may not be as obvious for you. In healthcare, we just, there we are. We're trying to help somebody who's sick. So I don't know. I think it's pretty prevalent in general because of what you were alluding to earlier, just how crazy this world is that we're in nowadays.
I love what you said about the purpose or having a why. Viktor Frankl talks about this, doesn't he, in regards of man's search for meaning, I think it's called, when he was in the Holocaust, but he didn't feel as bad as everyone else because he had he had a why to live for, essentially. I think that's really important, whether it's you're thinking about clients, whether you're thinking about listeners in respect of a podcast, or you're doing it for your kids. If you're a nihilist in respect of you don't think anything's worth it, you're not doing it for anything, that's why you think, well, what's the bloody point? There's nothing here to work for. And that's when you go into this depressive state. So it's always good to have something to aim at. And there's obviously loads of sort of stuff on that in terms of um, you know, if you don't know what direction you're going, no wind is favorable, for example. So there's loads of quotes on that. So moving on to your novel then. Um, so we're going to say something.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that one thing that I often tell medical audiences, at least, is if you are being very nihilistic, it may be a sign that you're burning out. So, what came first in this case? Sometimes I think, people who were very motivated and feeling that meaning and really, really going at it can burn out. And that may be one of the signs that they are burning out, that all of a sudden it's like, geez, I'm doing all this and not making any ground, not helping anything out. Or losing your empathy is another sign often of burnout.
So just a quick one on that before we move on. Can you force this feeling of having a why, a purpose? So, for example, if you're a professional football player, you obviously love the sport. You've grown up and you've loved it, and that purpose is very clear to you. Whereas for other people, it's maybe not as clear, and they're having to force. Oh, maybe I'm doing this for my kids, or I'm doing it to go on holiday next year, or whatever it's going to be. If someone is forcing it, is it a case that they're maybe on the wrong path and they need to maybe, well, either they're in burnout, as you've said, or maybe they need to maybe redirect the sail and head in a new to pastures new?
Yeah, I mean, certainly sometimes I think we're just in the wrong fit for who we are. And I think if we keep banging our head against the wall and nothing is making any ground, it does deserve some real introspection. And frankly, Javon, the first step whenever we're talking about burnout and trying to build our resilience, the very first step is to stop and take account of oneself. We call it self-compassion. And that is to sit down and think about yourself for a while. And it's so antithetical to a lot of people because you start feeling guilty. Oh, I should be, worrying about my kids, my wife, my job, my, this, that. And so it can be hard for people. But I think periodically we need to stop, think about ourselves. Who am I? What am I trying to do? What does bring me thrill? What brings me pleasure? What's bringing me down? What's making things so hard? Am I doing the stuff that really matters to me? You don't have to love your job. It doesn't have to have all the meaning in the world. Maybe you see it as an ends, as a means to an ends. Well, it does put food on the table. Okay, maybe I can appreciate it as such. But one way or the other, if we're going to help ourselves, we have to understand ourselves, or you don't even get out of the starting blocks.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, you can make it into something minuscule, like, oh, to keeping a roof over my head. Maybe it's just to allow me to have enough money to go and do the hobbies I like doing, or whatever it may be, or holidays and whatnot. So talking about hobbies, was the writing of a book, is that a sort of a passion of yours in terms of something you do after work and things like that? And obviously, you're in a bit of a similar boat to me in some respects. I've written also three non-fiction books. One's out, one's being published, and one is not yet finished. And I'm looking to maybe write a fiction book. So how was that transition for you to change from a fiction to a non-fiction? Because, I'm sorry, all the way around. Because I think that fiction must be a lot harder to write.
Maybe writing good fiction. I think it was easy, at least for me, to transition. It was I called it, verbal dysentery. I couldn't stop writing. But I think to write good fiction probably is really hard, and I'm not sure I'm anywhere close to that yet. But one way or the other, uh, I found it really liberating. When you write nonfiction, I it's sometimes, I mean, that's my whole life has been writing nonfiction. You're always writing things about your patients, you're always writing about science, things that you're doing, I mean, it's just one thing after another. And it begins to feel like, I'm back in grade school where I'm doing book reports, just taking some facts and finding a way to put them on a piece of paper. What was nice about fiction is all of a sudden the world just bursts open and anything can happen and any person can enter into it and they can have any characteristics whatsoever. I mean, you can go in a million directions. And so what happened, for example, in my book was it was 2.5 times longer than the finished product because they just couldn't stop writing. They're just, all these subplots and characters came in, and it wasn't that good to just go that way, but it sure as heck was fun. So I would argue probably easier to actually get words on paper, at least in the style that I do it. But harder when it comes down to whittling it down and editing it and making it more cogent and all that sort of thing. Now, there are some fiction writers who, every sentence is a work of art and they spend hours on it. That's not me at all. It just all spills out on the paper. So I don't know. What about you? What do you think you'll be?
So are you a planner or a prancer? Like
It's a little bit of both. I
a little
mean,
bit of both.
I have it somewhat mapped out, but
You discovery
once
right,
it gets off the
essentially.
Yeah, I mean, once it gets off the ground, things start to happen, and you may not be able to control it.
I don't know if you've heard that poem, and I think if you haven't, you'd really, really enjoy it. By Charles Bukowski. It's called If You Want to Be a Writer.
I know his work. I don't think I've read that one.
You'd love it. It's, you know what, when you said, I wrote this down when you said, oh, it was like I had verbal diarrhea or whatever you said, similar. And it's one of the things you said, unless it comes flying out the page and if you're sitting there in front of your laptop and nothing's coming out, you're not ready. If you're doing it for girls in your bed, if you're doing it for money, don't do it. Unless it comes like roaring out of you, basically don't do it. He goes, if you're waiting for it to roar out of you, keep waiting until that time is where it's there. And I really love that. And obviously I'm bastardizing it a little bit. He'd say that in much more eloquent ways than that. But it really gives you a perspective to say, look, as you said, you can open this whole world, and unless you have that feeling, I don't think you're ever going to be someone who writes anything good. Obviously, as you said, you double the length of the book because you have so much in there to actually write. And I think that's a sign of something that's going to be really, really, really good because you've got that passion for it, essentially. So what is a novel about? I understand it's got a neuroscience element to it.
Yeah, and of all things, they certainly talk about write about what you know. So it centers on a brain surgeon who's definitely overworked and probably a workaholic, probably burned out to one degree or another, who begins seeing things that he knows aren't there. Originally, he believes that he must be hallucinating. He's pretty sleep deprived and that sort of thing. But over time, he convinces himself that they're ghosts. And he begins having more and more experiences with these ghosts, and things start to come apart in his life.
So what? I don't want any spoilers, of course, but can you tell us a little bit about what goes wrong, and is it about the overcoming of obstacles, or again, is it a bit of a case of you don't want to give the game away?
Oh no, it becomes a challenge for him. First of all, just to keep track on what's reality and what's not, and it puts a huge stress on his marriage, and also he just becomes more and more irritable and difficult in the workplace. It starts to threaten his work as he again is having a hard time distinguishing, and he's trying to figure out why am I being bothered by these ghosts? I'm hoping the reader looks at it saying, are these ghosts real? Or, is he losing his mind? And what's contributing to that? And what could bring him some salvation? Or will he find his way? Or will things totally uh, blow up?
What are your thoughts on paranormal, let's say, activity? Is it a case of, do you think like ghosts and souls and things exist, or is it a case of it just being a myth? Maybe I don't know.
I have it's not my term, but I really resonate with what somebody called that I guess I would consider myself an optimistic agnostic, meaning I leave the jury out on the metaphysical on all levels, the metaphysical, the religious, the supernatural, or what's not immediately in front of us and measurable. I'm not going to exclude anything, so I don't want to be. I think a lot of people in the science world are quick to dismiss anything like that, and I think that's also some real fallacious thought processes. But I don't know what to believe, and I'm not gonna I'm gonna I'm not there on the other side, so I'm somewhere in the agnostic range, hoping that yeah, it would be nice to have a soul. It would be nice to have some sort of afterlife. It would be I'd be thrilled if I could meet a ghost.
You'd be thrilled if you could meet a ghost, obviously.
Yeah.
If you weren't deemed to be crazy, then yeah. In
Yeah,
fact,
yeah,
it's an
that,
interesting discussion, though, isn't it? With as you said, um, things with science. Science is in itself a fallacy to an extent. Atoms. The word atom means uncuttable in Greek, doesn't it? Atomos. But then they found the quarks and electrons that are smaller. So you can never know exactly what is true. There's always something else, and that's what fallibilism is. So, on a philosophical basis, how do we know what we know? I believe in fallibilism in some respects to say yes, it could be true, but also it might be disproved at a later point. There are some things that are called axiomatically true. So like 1 + 1 law was equal 2, for example. That's pretty clear. But there are a lot of other things that can't be sort of proven. Like before gravity was proved, it still existed, but only when it's proved, people say, "Oh, this must really exist." So, but things are there beforehand. Now, coming on to where I'm going with this. So, for ghosts, for example, when you turn on your television and there's an infrared ray that goes to the TV, we just can't see that because we're not on that plane. And we only see visible light, which is this on a massive spectrum. Is there a case of there being ghosts on a different spectrum? And that's a whole different discussion, I'm sure.
yeah, but in some ways, it brings us, to back to the neuroscience, when we remind ourselves that this machinery that we use to interpret all this is not a perfect set of machinery. It's not, it filters out a huge amount. It doesn't pick up a huge amount of what's going around us. And even the stuff it does pick up, it filters out a lot. And then it presents to us stories that we can function within our environment using those stories, to survive. But if we think it's a one-to-one representation of what is going on around us, we're fooling ourselves. And it's a very fallible machine. It's easily tricked. It doesn't store things all that well, or at least retrieve them all that well. And so everything that we come up with, even our science, is contrived by this system and interpreted by this system so that we can hopefully better understand what's going on around us, but more than anything, function within what's going on around us. So I think there's huge room for skepticism about anything. And to me, the ultimate science is scientific skepticism, where everything gets called into question. And we never truly prove things. We just eliminate certain other possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. No, no, nothing can be proved beyond beyond its hypothesis.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And
It's a case of my theory versus your theory until a new theory comes and disproves that, and then that's a new sort of belief system for a period of time. At some point they believe the Earth was flat, and if anyone said anything different, you think they were an idiot. Are we now at that point again, but with something else? And in 20, 30 years, I think, oh, these guys are idiots. Of course, ghosts exist. Of course, God exists or whatever it may be. But yeah, there's a lot to sort of unpick with that sort of side of things in terms of, as you said, the metaphysical. So if people want to reach out and obviously read your book, which is obviously a whole host of what we've discussed today, where can they reach out? And obviously, if someone wants to speak to you directly as well, Gary.
I do have a website, and it's just my name, Gary R. Simonds, Gary R. Simonds.com. So it's pretty easy to find. The books are there, a whole bunch of my writings there. I do some blogs for Psychology Today, particularly, lately, and I'd love for people to take a look at those and fire at me and make some commentary. You never answered fully though, Javon. What your take on the paranormal? Uh,
So my take on the paranormal. So first of all, I don't believe there is aliens out there. So people say, oh, the mathematics are there's this many billions of galaxies, the probability that there is other life out there is very, very high. That's the way they see it. And I actually invert that probability. I say, okay, no, it should be the other way around. We are the one in a million, not that there is that many out there and there should be another one. if that makes sense, based on the maths. I'll say no. Out of all those millions and millions of galaxies or whatever it is, the chance of there being somewhere perfect for human or life in general, that's the one in a million. So that's the way I would consider that. In terms of the paranormal, I do think there is. So this is going to get very I don't know how sort of muddy this might get, but in so I'm going to take all religion out of this. There is a number of different ways that you can believe in gods and metaphysics. There's obviously monotheistic religions where there's one god, polytheistic religions, etc., etc. There is also something called pantheism and panentheism. And pantheism is basically where nature is God.
Hmm.
And the way I would explain that is like, well, DNA is like an inherent code. You know, if you divide a circle, it's always going to be pi to a long code. There's the golden ratio in things, and all of, you know, if you zoom out, the helixes of the galaxies, it all fits into sort of some sort of system. So I think, and the panentheism is basically that, but God also sits on top. So for me, I think there is certain things within the system that we understand at the moment. So we understand the rules on gravity, we understand the rules on chemistry, for example, like the different elements and how they sort of come together. But with science, we're always a step behind. We do tests to work out the rules that are already there. We don't create rules, we discover rules. And I think that we've not yet got to a point where we can discover the paranormal. And there are things within, like for example, in space, between planets, there's dark matter. No one knows what's in that space. And I think when we start to work out what that is, we're going to get an answer. And I think there is a possibility that there is something, but I don't know whether it's ghosts, sort of angels, or some sort of alien. But I think there is something that still sits within our universe, but that it's not like an alien on a different planet with, green skin and things like that. That's I know it's quite a loose answer, but I think with these sorts of things that there cannot be anything concrete. You can only go on what you understand and the probability of something happening and what that may look like. So that's sort of my answer.
Yeah, I think our camps are fairly close. I would think. Um, but yeah, and it's funny. I I read recently this article. Don't ask me why, but it was by a theoretical astrophysicist, and it was just talking about the possibility that there could be infinite universes, that each universe only differs from the last one by one subatomic particle. And but it being infinite, therefore, you can go through a complete range. And I'm just reading it and I'm thinking, is this any different from holding religious beliefs, paranormal beliefs, or anything like that?
No, and this is the way I would look at that as well. Is like I don't know the percentage, but we're like a very high percentage in closeness in terms of DNA to like bananas and cockroaches.
Yeah.
But we have a huge divergence in what we look like and how we operate. So only a very small tweak in things can create something completely different. And that's what people don't understand. Just because we are very similar to monkeys doesn't mean that we are exactly this. We are the same. Oh, well, you're 99% the same, but what about the 1% different? I'm 80% the same as a banana. Doesn't mean I'm a banana, does it? So I think that sometimes science can create fallacies within itself as to ways of thinking. We can only think how we are programmed to think. And I think that sometimes that is massively the case. That we have been shoehorned into this sort of way of thinking that unless we prove something, we cannot sort of open the wheelhouse essentially. Which is what empiricism probably from a philosophical standpoint, you have to prove it and it's got to be something that you can measure and the sensors can prove it. But yeah, I think there's more to life than just waiting for the scientists to say this is true, even when they are wrong, at points. So yeah, it's just interesting the whole journey of life and see where it takes us.
Yeah, and that's what makes it fun and fascinating, right?
Absolutely. If everyone, had the same religious beliefs and everyone drove the same car and everyone looked the same, life would be very, very boring because you mentioned football. If everyone supported the same football team, who's going to support all the other football teams? Who they're going to play? Who, it's going to be no fans. It's going to be boring. So we need differences between us, and this is what makes life interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, somebody's got to root for Man U.
Well, exactly. Exactly. Well, thanks again, Gary, for being on the show. Been a valued guest. I mean, I've learned stuff. I've got, some stuff written down here. So yeah, I'm going to put all of the stuff in the show notes as to where people can reach out to you, with regards to the books, etc. Is there anything final that you want to say, that maybe we've missed out?
I mean, one thing would certainly be thank you so much. I think this is a delight. And this is the type of stuff I love. I love getting down into the weeds and exploring different concepts. And the more you hear from other people, the more you learn.
Absolutely.
So it's just a sheer pleasure. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Gary.